And let me once again welcome everybody officially to today's online event, Best Practices to Combat Human Trafficking, collecting data from official sources. Today's event is sponsored by the Harvard Kennedy School's Initiative to Stop Human Trafficking and the Government Innovators Network. And I'd like to turn things over to today's moderator, Amy Farrell, who is the Assistant Professor at the College of Criminal Justice and the Associate Director of the Institute on Race and Justice at Northeastern University.
Welcome everybody to today's conference. Thank you for joining us. Today we have a very important topic to talk about, which is how we begin to collect better data about human trafficking and best practices that are being developed in the field around collecting data, analyzing data, and beginning to make sense of what we know about the prevalence of human trafficking and the characteristics of trafficking. Today we have a great panel set up to talk about the research on human trafficking from a variety of different perspectives, helping us assess the field overall in terms of what we know about trafficking from the research that's been done to date, talking about how we use official sources of data to better understand the prevalence and characteristics of human trafficking, and beginning to explore innovative ways that we can use survey data, other types of methodologies like interviews and qualitative work to begin getting a better understanding of the characteristics of human trafficking in the United States and internationally. My area of interest in human trafficking, just to give you a little bit of background, I come at this problem from doing research in the area of policing. My research in the past has generally been on the administration of justice generally, with a particular emphasis on understanding how the police learn to recognize and identify new forms of crime. We got into human trafficking research myself and a group of colleagues at Northeastern about 6 years ago. First with a study to try examining how often local law enforcement agencies in the United States identified cases of human trafficking, while the crime of human trafficking was a fairly new crime in the U.S. in terms of its official designation, and certainly was not well understood by local law enforcement and was just beginning to be understood by federal law enforcement. I'll talk a little bit more later in the call about the results from some of those studies, but we've been able to gauge how often and under what circumstances local law enforcement agencies, state and county law enforcement agencies have been able to identify crimes of trafficking and to some degree the challenges that they face in identifying cases of trafficking, which hopefully will help us gather better data. Since human trafficking in the United States has been conceptualized in many regards under a criminal justice rubric, one of the places that I approach the question of how we understand and estimate trafficking is thinking about how we use officially reported criminal justice data to identify cases of trafficking, measure changes over time, and look at rates of crime patterns. Most of the callers today that you're going to hear from on this panel, and those of you in the audience probably recognize that there are a lot of challenges to using official reported data to identify cases of trafficking, particularly the lack of knowledge in the field of law enforcement generally and in other service provision areas about the characteristics of trafficking, how to identify it, and cases of trafficking indicators. And without improving our ability to recognize and count official reports of data, we're at a disadvantage in being able to understand trends and what's working and not working for our efforts to intervene in trafficking. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the call, and some of our other panels will be talking about official data as well. I would just like to kind of set the stage. Oh, sorry. Can you bring up the next one? I'm going to just try to set the stage a little bit about the importance of why we need to measure human trafficking. The next one. There are a lot of open questions in the field about the extent and the characteristics of human trafficking, as I mentioned. One of the biggest problems that we face is identifying how large the problem is. Some would suggest that this is an incredibly difficult question to answer, and it certainly is. I think we'll see many of the difficulties today in our discussion. But at the outset, there may be people in the field that argue that it's not important to necessarily know the extent of the problem. We know the problem exists, and we should take efforts to begin identifying ways to deal with the problem. However, most of you will know that programs and policymakers, legislators, and other stakeholders often demand an understanding of the scope and magnitude and areas that are affected by problems like human trafficking in order to justify expenditures and programming that will allow interventions to occur. Similarly, lacking information about the scope and prevalence of trafficking, as difficult as that is to gather, we also lack very strong information about the various characteristics of human trafficking. Human trafficking is a complex crime or social problem that includes varying definitions of what trafficking encompasses, varying levels of victimization from adults to children to labor exploitation to commercial sexual exploitation to foreign victims to domestic victims. And we have very little solid, reliable, good, systematic information about the characteristics of where we find certain kinds of victims, under what circumstances we find those victims, and how well our programs that we are implementing are targeting various victims of trafficking or perpetrators of trafficking across the United States in various regions and throughout the world. So in order to combat this problem effectively, we have to know more about where it exists and the patterns that either change over time or that change across regions in terms of trafficking activity. We also need to know more about the prevalence of human trafficking and the nature of human trafficking in order to assist trafficking victims. As I mentioned before, since trafficking makes up a variety of different types of victimization experiences, understanding where we do interventions and the success of those interventions demands that we have information about the extent of victimization and how those numbers change over time in order for us to be able to effectively assess if what we're doing about trafficking, programming we may be offering, intervention efforts that may be funded and started in local communities are actually having effect. And these are very complex issues to measure. We know that as we begin to try to measure social phenomena like trafficking, we will probably get better at finding those crimes, which in some cases will make it look like trafficking is going up. We've certainly found that across the board in many types of crimes, hate crimes, domestic violence, stalking, rape, other areas where we found hidden victimization that became exposed, and over time, we got better at being able to track and understand trends in crime change to be able to identify whether our interventions were working. But that's going to take some doing, and that's going to take us thinking about this problem a little bit more strategically. There are a number of limitations to the current research in human trafficking, and those are going to be discussed in more detail on this call. At the outset, the nature of human trafficking itself is quite difficult to measure. It's a relatively, though not a new problem, a newly conceived social phenomena that has certainly been newly labeled and prioritized both in the United States and internationally. And as a result, we have very core systematic ways to collect information about trafficking, such as standardized law enforcement reporting mechanisms, standardized non-governmental agency reporting mechanisms, or other ways that we normally gather information about victimization experiences. Additionally, the nature of the crime itself makes identifying and measuring trafficking even more difficult. Victims of human trafficking, in order for trafficking to be successful, oftentimes have to remain hidden. That is, they are unable to contact individuals who might be counting or looking at their victimization experiences. So since it's a hidden crime, we have more difficulty being able to apply any type of systematic or rigorous data collection technique, such as self-reported surveys or large-scale national data collection efforts that would try to capture and identify victimization experiences. So we have to identify new strategies for being able to better capture and methodologies that are suited to capturing the experiences of hidden populations. In addition, there are a lot of numbers out there about trafficking. Many of you are familiar with various estimates that have been bandied about in the United States about the prevalence of trafficking, about flows of trafficking in and out of the United States, and internationally about trafficking. And there's a lot of controversy about the various estimations. One of the problems is that estimates have used different definitions of trafficking across time. There's a lack of standardization across these estimates in terms of what they count when they're talking about trafficking. And there's also different methodologies that have been used to actually produce those estimates. That is, different actual strategies for deriving estimates have been used that actually produce very different numbers. And importantly, we have different sources of data that are being employed to provide the base to which estimates are derived. In some cases, estimates have been derived off counts of prostitution. In other cases, estimates have been derived off counts of law enforcement identification. And what goes into the beginning of the derivatives of estimates is incredibly important in being able to assess how we look at sort of differences that we see in the outcomes of those estimates. So one of the challenges that the field faces right now is somewhat of a legitimation crisis, in that because we have wildly different numbers of how many trafficking victims exist in the United States and internationally, some have been led to believe that trafficking is maybe a crime that we actually don't have a very good handle on, or an experience to which we can't measure very well, and maybe the concerns about trafficking are therefore unwarranted. But this isn't something that we necessarily have to give up on just because it's difficult. So today's panel is actually designed to talk about some of the challenges that we face in measuring trafficking and how we begin to overcome those challenges. And overcoming those challenges is important because there's an increased emphasis on measurement and understanding human trafficking, both in the United States and internationally. In the U.S., recent legislation from the Trafficking Victims Reauthorization Act have, since 2005, pushed for more reporting to come from the federal government around trafficking. The new reauthorization of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act actually requires a number of different reports to be produced by the different federal government agencies, including the Department of Justice, about the number of prosecutions and identified victims of trafficking, characteristics of different subpopulations of trafficking victims, and how well state laws are being used to identify trafficking. New changes in the 2008 reauthorization also include the addition of human trafficking as a crime category in the Uniform Crime Reports, which is a major change in thinking about how we gather data on trafficking, because trafficking will now be included in standard police reporting data that will go to the FBI, making it both easier in some ways and more challenging in other ways to be able to track trafficking over time in terms of law enforcement identification. Importantly, over 40 states have now passed legislation that criminalizes trafficking, and so we have also using various definitions of trafficking. So we have data that will be coming from those states about law enforcement efforts to identify trafficking. 14 of those states actually require studies or research councils to collect data within the states about human trafficking. So we have a bunch of pushes both federally and at state level in the United States to begin to measure and to get better at identifying human trafficking cases systematically. There's been a good deal of criticism thus far about the estimates of human trafficking that have come out of some of the numbers used by the federal government. In 2005 and 2007, the GAO in the United States released two different reports that actually criticized the measurement techniques that had been used by a number of officially cited statistics about the prevalence of human trafficking in the United States, and called for greater emphasis on developing systematic tools to measure trafficking internally and externally in terms of U.S. trafficking victimization and international trends as well. We're also finding new avenues for the systematic collection of human trafficking data that we're going to hear about on today's panel, both from law enforcement record data and also from victimization data. One of the things I'm going to talk about briefly, and this will be elaborated on further in just a minute, is that one of the new efforts that we have begun, and I've actually been involved with this with my partners at Northeastern University and the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C., and the Bureau of Justice Statistics, is an effort to actually begin systematically collecting information on the data that emerges from law enforcement investigations of human trafficking. So starting in 2008, we launched a new web-based incident reporting system for law enforcement agencies that were part of federally funded human trafficking task forces to provide detailed information on human trafficking investigations that emerged from those task force investigations. We began with 42 federally funded task forces that represent diverse regions across the United States. and created an incident-based reporting system where task forces actually using secured login procedures will enter information about the characteristics of the investigations, the characteristics of suspects and victims associated with those investigations. For the first time, giving us incident-level data about the characteristics of these diverse types of law enforcement efforts to identify and intervene in human trafficking situations occurring in local communities. We actually, on the slide that you see, posted a website which you can receive more information about that project. And Duren Banks from the Bureau of Justice Statistics will also be talking a little bit more about that effort in just a minute. The website that's posted there also has a good deal of public information about trafficking, including links to federal and state legislation, as well as government reports and news articles about issues of trafficking cases and measurements in trafficking situations. I'm going to go ahead and actually begin the discussion amongst the other panel members. And first I'm going to turn the panel over to Elzbieta Gozdziak, who's the Director of Research at the Institute for the Study of International Migration at Georgetown University. Dr. Gozdziak has done some groundbreaking work looking at an overview of human trafficking studies that have been done in the United States and internationally to begin to assess the quality of research on human trafficking and suggest a number of very important recommendations on how to move the field forward in terms of gathering better data and being able to analyze that data in order to more accurately understand the phenomena of human trafficking.
Okay, thank you, Amy. This is Elzbieta. I don't know if it will be better if I speak to the phone or through the speaker, because I actually heard you better through the speaker than through the phone. So maybe Jim can let me know. But in any case, thank you to the organizers for inviting me. And the few minutes that I have at my disposal, I'm going to talk about make some comments based on a project funded by the National Institute for Justice that Georgetown University and the Institute for the Study of International Migration conducted recently. The full report is available both on the Georgetown ISIMS website as well as on the NIJ website. But here I'm going to just talk about a few things. Well, we were tasked with an activity to, as Amy said, to assess. I budged at the verb assess because who am I to be assessing my peers' work? So we proceeded to actually categorize it because, and the budging at the verb assess was not just humorous, but depending on what discipline and what dimension of human trafficking you are interested in, your assessment of the research that is out there might be very different. So if you're a legal scholar, you're going to be much more impressed with legal scholarship than if you're like me, an anthropologist who wants empirically based studies with victims, including victims' perspective. So the first task was to actually see what's out there in terms of the English language and only English language literature. And then to make a determination what of those publications, be it journal articles, be it reports, books, or other forms, is based on research. And is it empirical research, non-empirical research, which disciplines, and so forth. So we started by using the usual academic databases and searches and ended up in the first instance with over 6,000 citations, raw citations, that were then imported into an EndNote and momentarily reduced for duplication to some 2,300. Of the 2,300, we then did more what we called manual purging and analysis to look what of it was really related to human trafficking, because as many of you probably know, since it's a sexy topic, a lot of people use the term trafficking to describe also other phenomena. And what of it was based on research. We reduced the citation then momentarily to a little over 700 citations, and as you can see on that slide, those were divided primarily between journal articles and reports. The slide here illustrates also when that literature was published, and not surprisingly, it spiked a couple years after the Palermo and the TDPA of 2000, and now in the past couple of years, the publications seem to have leveled off. As I said, we did not do an assessment, but we did a taxonomy of these publications. So we looked at what type of a publication, report, journal, book, whatnot, type of research and type of a review, i.e. whether these publications were based on empirical research and peer-reviewed, empirical research and not peer-reviewed, non-empirical research and peer-reviewed, and non-empirical research and not peer-reviewed. And you will see in a while why it was so important to be looking at the peer review process. We also looked, originally we started looking in a much more finely defined disciplines like anthropology, sociology, criminal justice. But then it turned out, and not surprisingly, that much of that research is interdisciplinary, and the research teams were composed of representatives of different disciplines. So we grouped those disciplines into broader categories and look at social sciences, law / criminal justice, medicine / epidemiology, and so forth. Then we looked at sampling issues. What kind of sampling, if at all, people were using. And then additional methodological issues, including research methods. And again, started with a very minute and well-defined categories, and then had to go to much broader labels, and you will see why. So we looked at qualitative research and quantitative research within qualitative, whether it was a case study, an ethnography, an evaluation, try to see what type of an evaluation, whether it was a comparative study. In quantitative, again, whether it was just statistical description, evaluation, comparative, whatnot. We looked at types of trafficking, trafficked populations, and geographical regions where the studies were being done, or where the populations that they were being talking about were from. If you look at the journal article, slide, it is very, it is quite telling, because journals were the largest classification, of the over 200 articles, 46%, so the largest grouping, consisted of articles that were non-empirical but published in peer-reviewed journals, which was a big surprise. I'm an editor of a journal myself, and it surprised me. This challenged because, and why? Because it challenged a very traditional notion in academia that the type of research published in peer-reviewed journals probably is more empirically inclined than not. But it seems that the peer-reviewed journals have published non-empirical research on trafficking in human beings because of the dynamics created by the sudden and very intense both political and academic interest in the phenomenon. So we concluded that editors probably realized that the readership wanted more information on trafficking, but little empirical research was being done, thus non-empirical studies, mostly in the form of literature and data review, description, and analysis of anti-trafficking policies, have been published. And our analysis demonstrates then that the peer review element, which is used as a measure of quality in academia, is not necessarily a good indicator of whether trafficking research is empirical in nature or not. And I'd be the first one to admit that as an editor, I too published things that were not based on empirical research, simply because my readership wanted more information. We then looked at populations, and this is an interesting one too. If you look at the pink don't know, my pointer is not quite working. At the pink side of the slide, almost half of the journal articles that we looked at fails to mention what trafficking population they were studying. So as you can see on my the design for my slides that I've used this cookie cutter kind of a graphic image, and that is not incidental, because unfortunately, many authors think that a trafficked person is a trafficked person. Doesn't have gender, doesn't have age, doesn't have any other characteristics. So that's a very interesting finding. You look at the reports, they're actually a little different. In contrast to journal articles, the vast majority of reports were actually based on empirical research. About 68% of all the reports were empirically based, but only 1%, which really translates to 6 reports out of the 400 plus, was peer-reviewed. And the peer-reviewed reports tended to be the reports funded by NIJ, simply because NIJ has a peer review process built into their funding mechanism. Everything else was not did not undergo a formal peer review. When we look at populations, reports were again much better in defining who they were looking at. So we actually have a differentiation between boys and girls when people talk about children. In many other publications, children are subsumed under the women and children label and not differentiated by gender and not differentiated by age. And oftentimes the women and children means really a much older girl, 17, 18, or 19-year-olds that are in that population. Okay, let me hurry up here. We then try to make some, based on the analysis of, and you will see in the report that there's many more graphs describing the taxonomies that we use to look at the variety of writings. But then we tried to look at some of the key issues. So for example, theory. And Ronald Weitzer, who is a sociologist at GW in Washington, D.C., had once written that in no area of social sciences has ideology contaminated knowledge more pervasively than in writings on the sex industry. And we concluded in our analysis that that claim certainly can extend to trafficking for sexual exploitation, an area where many canons of scientific inquiry have been suspended and research deliberately skewed to serve a particular political or moral agenda. Much of the research on human trafficking in that review, particularly the one focusing on sexual exploitation, has been conducted by activists involved in anti-prostitution campaigns. And by that extension, many of these activists have adopted a very extreme version of radical feminist theory, which does not necessarily distinguish between trafficking for forced prostitution and voluntary migration, illegal or irregular, for sex work, and claims that all sex workers are victims of trafficking. Then we looked at some stuff related to moral crusades propagated by different types of groups. We then switched to looking at whether the same kind of things can be said or not, whether the research on trafficking for labor exploitation is in any better shape theoretically. But unfortunately, it is too disconnected from theory. There are virtually no attempts to analyze the issue of cross-border trafficking for labor exploitation within existing international migration theories. There's no evidence in the literature of any new attempts to develop a theoretical framework in which to analyze that phenomenon. And usually it's poverty and aspirations for better way of life that are talked about as the main push factors. There's more to international migration theory than push and pull factors. Methodologically, it was a very interest, and Amy already alluded to many of these issues in her opening remarks. Similarly to the theoretical approaches, development of innovative methodologies in this field is still in its infancy, although we're seeing good glimpses of hope. By and large, the authors of the 700 plus writings that we looked at relied on unrepresentative samples. Most studies relied on interviews with key stakeholders who perhaps have a stake in promoting a particular view of human trafficking and its victims. And don't get me wrong, I'm an anthropologist. That's all I do. I interview people. However, there is a big difference between systematic ethnographic interviewing and victims or stakeholders interviewed by untrained advocates, because then it doesn't really amount to much more than perhaps an anecdote. And so I'm all promoting in-depth, open-ended, and systematic interviews as the very valuable tools to particularly understand the nuances of trafficking in persons, to understand the characteristics of the victims and the perpetrators. But as I said, that cannot amount to just getting a couple of anecdotes, because as somebody once said, in these kind of interviews you get two types of responses on each end of the spectrum. You get the best stories and you get the worst stories, and most of life happens in between. So in terms of should have a recommendation. So in terms of recommendations, what we recommended in this report is an increased funding and need for both quantitative and qualitative research to provide both the macro and micro level understanding of human trafficking. Methodologically sound compilation of statistical data to inform, if nothing else, appropriation of funds for counter-trafficking initiative, but also for services to the survivors. Rigorous ethnographic and sociological studies based on these in-depth, done by trained interviewers, interviews or other qualitative data collection methodologies. And last but not least, monitoring and evaluation of studies to identify effective policies and best practices, successes of programs that have been funded, and that kind of stuff. So this is for my initial remarks. Hopefully, in the discussion, we'll be able to talk about other things. Thanks.
Great, thank you. We're going to move on to the next speaker in just one moment. I want to let people know that we've been getting a number of questions coming in, and we're hoping to get to your question and answer period just after 11 o'clock, and so we will be getting to those questions. Additionally, the contact information and names of all the speakers will be posted on the website, and we'll make those available at the end of the discussion as well. Our next speaker today is going to be Duren Banks. Duren is the Chief of the Prosecution and Adjudication Statistics Unit at the Bureau of Justice Statistics for the U.S. Department of Justice. And Duren is going to speak to us today a little bit about the efforts to collect federal data on human trafficking.
Thanks so much, Amy. Good morning, everyone. Amy talked a little bit about the human trafficking reporting system, and this is something that we have developed at the Bureau of Justice Statistics in partnership with the folks at Northeastern University Institute of Race and Justice, and also the Justice Policy Center at the Urban Institute. So we are very thankful to have partnered with them to work on this system together. In addition, the folks who enter data into the system are funded by the Department of Justice. There are task forces across the country that receive funding from the Bureau of Justice Assistance. So we have a number of partners who have been very helpful in helping us to collect this data. I do like to say, first of all, that the data that I'm going to talk about today really represent just a snapshot of what we know so far from what the task forces have been investigating and collecting information on. The HTRS system does follow the definition of human trafficking that was developed in the TVPA legislation. And that is specifically that human trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for one of three purposes. And those three purposes are labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion, a commercial sex act through the use of force, fraud, or coercion, or any commercial sex act if the person is under 18 years of age. And so what's really important to recognize here is that trafficking often involves movement of people from their own communities and transporting them across borders or within a nation, but it's not necessary that they be physically transported in order for it to be a crime under the TVPA definition. And also it's very important to recognize that if the alleged victim is under the age of 18, then it is a commercial sex act, then it's automatically human trafficking under our definition. Now again, for the purposes of the information I'm going to report today, we collected data over a 21-month period starting from January 1st, 2007 through September 30th, 2008. All the data are continually updated and validated by our partners and also by the task forces, so the information is continually evolving. The task forces that have been entering information into the system, there are 38 of them that are funded by the Department of Justice that are the sources for the data I'm going to talk about today. And combined, they roughly cover about 25% of the population in the United States. And here you can see on a map what we've shown is the basic geographic dispersion of the 38 task forces. And the bubbles that you see on the map give us a snapshot of, as of our most recent report, where those cases are falling. And you'll see that the task forces were funded in a strategic manner. They really cover a lot of the border states and some states along the northeastern quarter as well. Overall, over the 21-month reporting period that we do have, more than 1,200 incidents of human trafficking were reported by the task forces. About 78% of those were still under investigation at the end of our reporting period. So as I've said before, these were ongoing investigations, and the information I'm going to report today will continue to be updated and validated. Of the more than 1,200 incidents, approximately 83% of those involved sex trafficking, and another 12% involved labor trafficking, and about 5% were an unknown type of trafficking. We did collect some information on who was involved in investigating the incident, and approximately 83% of the investigations involved a state or a local law enforcement agency as the lead agency. We found that more often the federal agencies were involved as the lead agency in the labor trafficking incidents as opposed to the sex trafficking incidents. But as you might expect, since these are task forces, nearly 80% of all the incidents that were reported involved more than one investigating agency, so there are some groups working together to investigate here. I'm going to talk briefly about what we've learned about the victims and the suspects involved in these incidents, and I'd like to again just reiterate that this information is continually being updated. But with the 1,200 incidents that were reported by the task forces, we identified more than 1,400 alleged victims, and this averaged out to be about 2.1 victims per incident. The potential victims were overwhelmingly young females, particularly in incidents of sex trafficking. They were very likely to be Hispanic and undocumented or qualified aliens, particularly among labor trafficking incidents. A little over a quarter of the alleged sex trafficking incidents have multiple victims, while nearly half of all the labor trafficking incidents have more than one victim. Looking again at the gender, with labor trafficking incidents, nearly 40% of the victims were male, while as expected, the sex trafficking victims were overwhelmingly female. 99% of those victims were female. And again, the victims were young. Among the sex trafficking victims, about 30% were 17 or younger, and another 40% were 18 to 24 years old. The labor trafficking victims did tend to be a little bit older than the other types of victims. And among the task forces and information we have reported, more than half were U.S. citizens. Turning over to the suspects, more than 870 suspects were identified by the task forces and averaged out to be about 1.8 suspects per incident. As you can see here, the vast majority of them were male. In labor trafficking incidents in particular, about a third of the suspects were female, so we're more likely to see females in the labor trafficking incidents. Again, among labor trafficking suspects, Asians represented the largest racial ethnic category, with 37% of the suspects there identified as Asian. And again, looking at the sex trafficking suspects, the folks who were identified as black represented the largest proportion, with 44%. For some of the incidents, we did have information on both the suspect and victims, and where both that information was available, we found that they largely mirrored each other. Most of them involved only male suspects and female victims, and most of them involved only citizens of the United States. Okay, and again, as all these investigations are evolving, some of them, and it's only a very few of the 1,200, reached a point in the investigation where we could understand what happened to the suspects and whether there was a confirmation of the human trafficking or not. Only about 10% of the cases did reach that point where they could confirm or not confirm whether there had been a human trafficking violation. Of those cases that were closed, 80% were not confirmed as human trafficking. And in general, this is because of the definition that we adopted for confirmation of human trafficking and is set forth by the TVPA. And in cases that were not confirmed as human trafficking, most of them were because the victims refused or failed to cooperate with the investigation. In some other cases, the accusations were determined to be unfounded, or there just wasn't sufficient evidence to make that determination. The slide you're looking at now talks about the limited information we do have on what happened to suspects for confirmed incidents of human trafficking. 68% of the arrested suspects here were actually arrested at the state level, and 26% at the federal level. Among those who were charged with human trafficking, again, the majority were charged in state courts versus federal courts. You can see here also that most were convicted of some offense, and there's also some sentencing information, but again, due to the ongoing nature of these investigations and the time it takes to prosecute a case, we do have limited information on conviction and sentencing, and hope to update that information soon. That's about all I have to say about the statistics that we have to date. As I've said before, we're continuing to update those, and we're also looking to expand our reporting platform beyond the 38 task forces that have been entering data to date, and we hope to have more information very soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Duren. We're going to move on to our next speaker now. Fabrizio Sarrica is a research expert in the Division for the Policy Analysts and Public Affairs at the UN Office of Drugs and Crime. And Fabrizio is going to give us some information about international statistics and comparisons across countries in measurement of human trafficking.
Yes, thank you. First of all, let me thank you for having invited me here. I would like to briefly discuss about our global report on trafficking in person that has been launched in February 2009. This presentation will last 5 to 7 minutes, and if you want to have more information, you can find the link to the global report to this in the first slide. In 2007, we started a 2-year study on what I would call the state of the world's response to trafficking in persons, and this study resulted in this global report. I say, the best definition of this report would be, let's say, an assessment of the state of world response. The report is based exclusively on official information. Does this really represent just what I can call the tip of the iceberg? We are just referring to the detected cases detected by national authorities for its great majorities, but also to some small extent also cases detected by international organizations and by NGOs. But 95% of the cases we are reflecting in this report are information collected by national authorities. This implies, from our perspective, from the methodology and the information that we have collected, that these data cannot be used for cross-country comparison. We cannot compare the criminal justice statistics from one country with criminal justice statistics of another country, nor estimate result. Estimates on the hidden population, the total number of victims, can result from the information that we have collected. Nevertheless, some interesting results are present in this report, and I will briefly talk about these results. But first, I would like to discuss also the research structure and the data coverage. A global report is, of course, a great challenge, and we always have the risk to have a very centralized approach to local phenomenon, to different patterns, to different flows, so on and so forth, and to different situations on local level. That's why we have established a monitoring network through the help of our field office. Basically, we had 11 researchers deployed in our field offices. 5 of those 11 researchers were just in the African continent. These 11 researchers were trained here in our headquarters in Vienna, and they all use a standardized tool, and they were supervised by our office here in Vienna on daily basis. So it was a coordinated and standardized activity of data collection. These researchers were proactively collecting information. Proactively means that we did not send a questionnaire to the national authorities and waiting for their reply, but they interviewed the national authorities. They were in constant feedback with constant follow-up with the national authorities. They met the national authorities in several occasions, and it was, of course, a full-time job for these researchers. Eventually, we managed to cover 155 countries and territories. In blue, in this map, you see the countries that we managed to cover, and I think this is one of the most important results of this report: the coverage and the local approach to the data collection. The next 3 slides will report about the results. These first slides refer about the institutional response. I know that maybe this might not be interesting from the sociological or criminological perspective, but from institutional perspective, I think this is the most relevant result. What we notice is, first of all, that the legislative framework in great part of the world is very recent. 45% of the countries that we've covered introduced the specific offense of trafficking in person in their national legislation just recently, between 2003 and 2008. That means that, as I said, the legislative framework is very recent, and this probably explains the fact that the criminal justice response at global level it's very low. Of course, there are some regional differences, but overall, 40% of the countries covered by this report did not record a single conviction for trafficking in persons. That means that in these 40% of the countries, basically traffickers are experiencing total impunity. And this is, I think, something that really, anytime I think about it, it still leaves me surprised. Going to the more, let's say, qualitative results, these slides report about the profile of the victims and the type of methodology that we adopted. Of course, again, this is just a reflection of the cases that have been detected by the national authorities around the world. From these slides, what we can see is that women and girls represent the great majority of the victims detected, almost 80% of the victims. I didn't include in these slides the number of victims we are referring to. We are referring to about 11,000, 12,000 victims detected for each of the years here considered. So 2003, 2004, 2005, and 2006, the percentage has to be referred to about 11, 12,000 victims detected at global level. So I was saying women and girls represent the great majority. Child trafficking has been detected in all regions of the world and appears to be increasing, at least referring to detected cases, and it accounts for about 15-20% of the total number of detected victims around the world, but with great regional differences in some parts of the world, child trafficking is the great majority, represent the great majority of the detected cases. Also some interesting information concerning the profile of the offenders. The role of women or female offenders appears to be particularly important compared to other crimes. As you might know, normally women offenders account for a very small percentage of the number of total offenders. Normally about 10% of the offenders convicted are women for normal crime, for crimes. As far as trafficking in person is concerned, this is not the case. Women may account for about 20 or even 30% of the number of offenders convicted or prosecuted, and in some area of the world, even sometimes women are more frequently convicted, more frequently detected than men. Of course, this opens up to new questions. So why are women so disproportionately represented in these statistics? And this is, of course, a question that is open for the researchers. Finally, trafficking flows. As far as the trafficking flows are concerned, first, domestic trafficking, we realized from the data emerging from this report that domestic trafficking appears to be more prevalent than we originally thought. In at least 32 countries, internal trafficking, domestic trafficking has been detected, and in some countries it appears to be a major issue. For more on this, I would invite you, for instance, to take a look to the German statistics or to the Dutch most recent statistics. We believe that domestic trafficking is probably more than that. It is under-detected, and it is probably recorded under other offenses, prosecuted under other offenses, such as pandering or slavery cases. Intra-regional trafficking, meaning cross-border trafficking or trafficking from countries to neighboring countries, is much more relevant than long-distance trafficking. Normally, each region has its own, let's say, hotspots as origin of trafficking. In a very limited number of countries, we found that long-distance trafficking is more prevalent. When we talk about long-distance trafficking, transcontinental trafficking, then East Asia appears to be a real hotspot at global level. East Asian victims have been detected basically in all regions of the world, including, as you will see, including also Southern and Central Africa, including Central America and South America, and in other regions of the world. Overall, we have found that East Asian victims have been detected in more than 20 countries around the world. Again, these are briefly just the global results. The report is very detailed. It contains 155 country profiles with country information and also some regional analysis, but here, of course, I had the time just to present the information, the most relevant information that were valid for a global overview of the trafficking situation around the world. I thank you, and I'm, of course, glad to take your question at the end of the conference.
Thank you so much, Fabrizio. We're now going to turn over to our last panelist, Neil Weiner, who's the Director of Research at the Vera Institute of Justice, who's done some very important work on child victims of commercial sexual exploitation and has recently completed a study looking at how you develop tools to collect data from victim service providers about human trafficking. And we'll start taking questions after the speaker's finished.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to thank the organizers of the conference call from the Carr Center and the Ash Institute for organizing and the session and for inviting me. I'll be presenting today on measuring human trafficking, lessons from New York City. It's a report that we prepared on the New York City Trafficking Assessment Project that was funded through the National Institute of Justice. This report in its entirety is at the National Criminal Justice Reference Service. Will be on our newly revised Vera website shortly. Right now the site is mostly static because it's undergoing changes, but so there are a number of different ways in which you can obtain the report and look and see much more detail on the things that I'll be discussing rather quickly today. In 1999, almost 10 years ago, almost to the month, it was in May, I got a call from a colleague of mine at the University of Pennsylvania, Richard Estes, a fellow who I eventually conducted a piece of research with on the commercial sexual exploitation of children, which was also funded by the National Institute of Justice. That study was born from some conversations he had had, and Richard is a child welfare advocate, researcher, expert, quite ferocious in that regard in his advocacy for children worldwide. He had been at a conference overseas, I believe, on the Southeast Asian Rim, and there was some talk about trafficking in children. He hadn't heard very much about that at the time, but came back deeply disturbed and concerned because of all the reasons that all of us know obtained then, but with relatively little publicity at the time. And he called me up and asked if I'd be interested in pursuing what we eventually called first-generation research on commercial sexual exploitation of children. I checked with some colleagues at the National Institute of Justice about whether there was any appetite for research on this topic, particularly in the comparative section. And as you know, NIJ program managers and monitors typically tell you, we're interested, submit, and let's see what the peer reviewers have to say. We did just that, and the peer reviewers thought that it was a worthwhile project. It was essentially a three-nation examination. The United States, it was anchored here, Canada, the University of Montreal, its criminology department, and in Mexico at a university there as well. We conducted an analysis of any and all information that we could find about the commercial sexual exploitation of children, and as you might guess, there was virtually nothing that was of scientific value at that time. Most of the material, it was important material, was anecdotal, was from journalists. There were some documentaries that we could obtain, but the kind of scientific work that's both rigorous and robust hadn't really blossomed at that point. 2 years later, we completed our report. There were a number of recommendations that we made. One which is pertinent to today's conversation. One of the recommendations that we made was, you guessed it, that more research on commercial sexual exploitation and on human trafficking more generally needed to be conducted, and that research needed to be, we thought of as very basic research on applied measurement. That is, what do you ask people, and also on subject identification, which is what we technically call sampling issues. How do you identify access and then meet with persons who might be trafficking victims?
Mr. Weiner, this is Jim Coney. Sorry to interrupt you, but I just wanted to make sure that you can. Are you able to move through your slides?
Yeah, I'm just going to move. I think so. I just want to.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
I'm not quite there yet. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. No. Sorry. Didn't mean to rush you.
Okay. Fast forward 2 years to 2001. We presented that report and those recommendations, including that basic scientific recommendation, on September 10th, 2001, in Washington, D.C., with the sponsorship of the National Institute of Justice, and everyone knows what happened the following day in New York City. 9/11. For at least 3, maybe 4 years afterwards, while trafficking continued, the focus on trafficking as an issue began to atrophy, but with a resurgence several years later. And with that resurgence, this study was born, Measuring Human Trafficking Lessons from New York City. I think it's fair to say, given what Amy, Elzbieta, and Duren and Fabrizio have said, that the current status of scientific research in human trafficking involves at least three elements. It's challenging still. The scientific research is thin, if not impoverished. But the good news is that it's advancing both on the sampling side, that is, identifying people who might be at risk, but also it's also advancing on the measurement side, which we're talking about today, which is what you ask people once you actually identify them as possible trafficking victims. The previous presenters covered very well the challenges of measuring human trafficking. It's a hard-to-reach population. There's underreporting. There's variations in statutes, law enforcement institutions and practices, and cultural understandings of what human trafficking entails. And all of that is meant to underscore the fact that with regard to measurement, there's a lack of standardized measurement tools or procedures for systematic data collection. Across the board, I think, with regard to official data, although that's being remedied in the ways other discussants have mentioned today, as well as with regard to field work that is in identifying trafficking victims in their communities, and discerning what it is to ask them to permit a reliable and valid assessment as to whether indeed they are a trafficking victim. The measurement problems are formidable. To give you at least one slice into what those problems entail, there are a number of different terms and domains of experience of exploitation that often get confused with one another. Most generally, there are victims of exploitation, whether that's labor exploitation, sexual exploitation, other forms of exploitation. That's the largest oval on the slide, victims of exploitation. a subset of exploitation, victims of trafficking, as defined by a variety of international, federal, or national and more local statutes. Amongst victims of trafficking, there are a subset of emancipated victims, those who are free from the trafficking fetters and are at some liberty to move and to engage in civil society, and who can contact institutions, whether those are law enforcement institutions or social service institutions or legal service institutions. Amongst emancipated victims, there's a subset of presumed victims, persons who are in contact with authorities, whether that's social service authorities, human rights authorities, law enforcement, who, for one or another reason, are believed to potentially be victims of trafficking, but who have not yet been formally and rigorously identified as such. The problem that we addressed in this research was to determine ways that were both rigorous and robust to measure, which is simply a simple way, a technical way of saying to identify persons who are in fact victims of trafficking. That's Oval 5, a subset of presumed victims. And amongst victims who are identified through a measurement tool, some of those victims are assisted, whether that's through law enforcement or social service agencies, human rights agencies. Then amongst assisted victims, there are those who are certified, who receive formal standing under legal statutes, typically federal but also state statutes as well. So our interest was in developing a measurement tool that let us identify accurately, reliably, and validly a subset of victims of exploitation generally, so that we could, in fact, identify with some reliability and validity who indeed were victims of trafficking. The New York City Trafficking Assessment Project had a number of integrated, mutually reinforcing objectives. First, we wanted to design a trafficking screening tool. That's simply the measurement tool. A set of questions that you would ask presumed victims of trafficking. We wanted to make certain that that screening tool was developed in consultation with diverse stakeholders, in particular social service agencies that serve diverse stakeholders. We wanted to make certain that the screening tool was developed using evidence-based best measurement practices, that is, best practices within the context of applied measurement and applied measurement theory. We wanted to make certain that the screening tool was augmented by a toolkit. And now a toolkit is simply a set of discussion points that involve training for persons who would be using the screening tool, as well as suggestions about how to probe for victimization, how to ask questions, how to ask questions without traumatizing, re-traumatizing victims, and the settings in which
Neil, I hate to interrupt you, but we're going to have to kind of get to the conclusion so that we can take questions. We're running out of time quickly, so if you could just get us to the key points, and then we'll take some questions.
Okay. Key points. Let me just then jump to the very quick review of the piloting that we did in the field. We had initial stakeholder agency review of the baseline screening tool. We reviewed the Palermo protocol, the statutory requirements for the Palermo protocol, the New York State anti-trafficking law, and the TVPA. We also reviewed a number of recommended items and questions to include in a variety of questionnaires that had been developed by other agencies, international and national. We conducted, based on the recommendations of the stakeholder agencies, we implemented interview simulations with agency staff to determine question flow, the length, interview dynamics, and when to suspend the interviewing process. We applied the questionnaire, the interview questionnaire in a field application to get feedback on content, format, and modes of administration. We used case file applications, that is, we were provided with redacted case files from the participating stakeholder agencies. There were 11 social service agencies, to determine whether we were missing any content in the interview and to assess tool validity. Then we closed out the research piloting with lessons learned from all of the above activities to improve the tool and the toolkit. The final administration of the screening tool that was recommended based on the work that we had done, the mode of administration face-to-face as opposed to some of the benefits that might accrue to questionnaires, but face-to-face interviews have lots of benefits. You can read about those in the report. Screening timing, the screening needs to be done when the client is ready, after trust has been created between the intake staff member and the client. Screening participation, we believe that it ought to be universal screening for a variety of reasons, mostly because there's no standardized short screening tool that allows screening at intake to discern clients who might be at high risk. So we're suggesting, at least initially, a universal screening process. Perhaps later we'd like to look at a reduced form of the screening instrument, so that subpopulations might not necessarily have to be screened in such great depth. Interviewer responding report, trust is the key. We found that again and again in our applications. Client protection is paramount. Re-traumatization is one of the more critical protections that need to be built into any screening instrument. There are others as well that we discuss with regard to the screening tool. And one of the other critical features is language access. There needs to be both language sensitive as well as gender, age, and nationality sensitive questions and approaches to asking those questions. We thank you for letting me present, and I'll be glad to answer any questions about the screening tool and the toolkit that we produced and deposited at NIJ. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. It's a really fascinating study and an excellent tool, so hopefully we'll get some questions about it. I'm going to go to our first question we've had, and I would encourage others, if you have questions, to please email them in. Our first question is from Claude Destray, who asked that there are 22 agencies in the United States alone that collect some data on human trafficking. Do you envision a central agency that will collect this data and set standards for methodology? I'll answer really quickly, and others may have some information to share as well, just by saying that the latest reauthorization of the TVPA actually specifies an integrated database to be created to try to bring together data across federal agencies about human trafficking, using the Human Smuggling and Trafficking Center as a coordinating agency to try to collect that data. But it's an excellent question, and part of our challenge here is that data is both not systematically collected and isn't well coordinated across state agencies. Our second question, and others can certainly weigh in on that during this question and answer period. I'm sure others have more information as well. Our second question is actually to Elzbieta. It's from Eric Goodwin, who asked, in your initial search for publications or subsequent paring down of the original sample of 2,300 publications, have you identified any groups or types of trafficking or slavery publications that might not have made it into the sample?
Meaning what? Should I answer now, Amy, or?
Yes, Elby. Yes, go ahead.
Well, yes. we disqualified from the over 6,000 citations pieces that were not based on research, that were opinion pieces. So they might have had, there might have been essays there that talk about a variety of types of exploitations that some people might have qualified as trafficking, or might have even met the scrutiny of the various definitions of human trafficking, but they were not based on an analysis of a policy or legislation. They were not based on any empirical or non-empirical research, but they were just the author's opinions. So yes, there's plenty of that in a piece that I had written. I've sort of divided those publications into writings about human trafficking and literature based on research on human trafficking. The whole bibliography of the 740-some is attached to the report, so you can see what we had included in the report. We also go very systematically through the various criteria we used. I didn't have time to go through them. That we used to put the different publications in one pile or the other.
Thanks so much.
Sure.
Our next question is actually for Duren, but others may want to weigh in on this as well. Lisa Eisenbach asks, does the data distinguish victims of forced labor for drug trafficking? Would the likelihood that victims would be boys, and particularly Hispanic or black boys, make the subgroup harder to identify or record as human trafficking victims?
The short answer is no. We do not differentiate currently by the type of forced labor trafficking. The data that we do get has some narrative to it, so it might be possible at a future time to look through some of the descriptions of the type of incidents, but the variables that we collect to date do not allow us to distinguish at that level. And Amy, you might have more to add there.
Right. There is a category in the human trafficking reporting system that allows law enforcement agencies to provide some detailed information about the type of trafficking within sex trafficking and labor trafficking subtypes. They're probably more important than the classification in the data collection system, which is always a challenge. It's actually the challenge that local law enforcement agencies are unlikely to probably think that you have victims of forced labor trafficking in the drug trade. So the issue of the large proportion of victims of trafficking identified in official reports of data being women and girls may very likely be a function of the realities of trafficking, but it equally could be likely a function of perceptions about victims of trafficking and who police and other official reporters think those victims are likely to be. So while law enforcement may come into contact with victims of forced labor in a variety of circumstances, if they can't identify them as victims of trafficking, they're not going to get recorded as such. So it's a real challenge that we both increase our capacity to identify correctly various types of trafficking if we ever hope the data that's collected out of this official reporting to be able to get at those realities as well. Do other panelists have any input on that broader question about how we define trafficking and its relationship to official statistics? Well, if not, people can weigh in when we get to other questions. We have a question actually from Phil Sandella, who asks, he works with an NGO helping victims in Dubai, Ethiopia, and in the United States, in Ohio, and has a few questions that I think would relate to a number of panelists being able to answer them. One is, can anyone suggest funding sources for our victims, for victim-focused organizations? We found little interest from businesses and individuals to support this hard-to-understand issue. The second question is there a mechanism to get a contract to establish an Ohio reporting system as part of the DOJ program that Duren mentioned? So a way to get Ohio's data to be entered into the HTRS. And thirdly, any suggestion on how we can be more effective in helping the victims we serve in Ethiopia and the United Arab Emirates. I'll take the second question there, and maybe Duren can pipe in this as well, which is that we would be happy to talk to Phil or to any other organizations that may be representing agencies that collect data on human trafficking in states that don't have human trafficking task forces, or where in regions where those task forces don't exist. And would be happy to speak offline about the possibilities of integrating data that's currently being collected into other parts of the National Reporting Program. Over the next year, we'll be expanding the National Reporting Program to begin including law enforcement agencies that are not participating in federally funded task forces, which will greatly enhance the reach of the HTRS reporting system. Duren, did you have other thoughts about that, or anyone else for other parts of Phil's question?
You responded exactly as I would have, that we are very interested in expanding the reporting capabilities, and so would welcome an opportunity to talk to you further offline about the possibilities of implementing it in Ohio.
Other responses? One of the questions that I'll pose to the panel is actually, now that we've had a chance to review, either through meta-analysis procedures, creating new data collection systems, or evaluating the methodologies used in other data collection systems, what do people think are some of the most promising methodologies or necessary steps that are needed to take to actually improve the quality of the data that we collect on human trafficking, either in the United States or internationally?
This is Duren. I think this was echoed by all the panel members, that I think the biggest obstacle is understanding of what human trafficking is and coming up with a common definition. Some other studies that have been supported by NIJ and other organizations have really found that the law enforcement agencies and other members of task forces that we really rely on to collect this information have a limited understanding of what human trafficking is, and often miscategorize it because it co-occurs with other types of crimes. And so I think as far as a methodology, there's a lot of great ones out there, but in order to get to a good methodology to collect the information, there needs to be a huge amount of training and understanding and awareness by the folks that we rely on to identify these crimes and support the victims in the first place.
This is Elzbieta. I think I would like to make also a comment on, not just collecting data on the scope of the phenomenon, but once, for example, like within the United States, when we have officially by the federal government designated victims or survivors of human trafficking, that there is an effort to systematically collect data about the victims. And I know that the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops is undertaking an activity to at least have some sort of a database on the victims that they serve on the per capita reimbursement, through the per capita reimbursement program. But I think it would be an interesting discussion to have is, what else do we want to know about the victims or the perpetrators, and how the data ought to be collected and how it should be entered into the database. For example, the GAO reports are talking about the value of the IOM database, but although they rolled it out officially, not very many researchers have had access to it, and we also don't know, how they what they determine to be an interesting tidbit of information to be entered into the database about those victims, and then how it can be done in a standardized manner, so all the missions of IOM do it in the same way. I am with the presenters who said, well, let's get beyond just the scope, but go more in depth on what do we know about this phenomenon. And from my perspective, knowing more about the victims is extremely important.
Hello, this is Neil Weiner. I agree with the other discussants. I think that there are a couple of ways to approach addressing some of the issues of definition and methodology. As far as I know, there's no working group or organized venue to deal with issues of measurement and sampling and research design. There are other vehicles and models, for getting to that point. But I think something like that, that is a place with sustainable funding and sustainable staff or member involvement would be important, because there are lots of thorny issues that have been raised. For example, when we talk about standardized definition, that doesn't necessarily mean that definition shouldn't be able to accommodate a number of different sub-definitions within it, so that you would have a versatile but standardized definition. That is one of the things that we try to incorporate into our screening tool were both legal and what we think of as behavioral elements of human trafficking that might not be caught or stipulated in statutes, but which by common definition or by at least some common standards or more comprehensive and wider standards might be understood to comprise aspects of trafficking. So the measurement tool that we produced, like most other standardized measurement tools, if they're well constructed, lets you look at the different elements that you're asking questions about, put them together in different combinations, and see how many human trafficking events, prevalence, or incidents you have based on a variety of different configurations, i.e. definitions, of human trafficking. So I think that whatever standardized definition you would want would certainly need to be based on a consensus as to what the purpose of that definition is for. Is it to identify persons who meet the TVPA standards, that meet state standards for trafficking, or some alternative definition? And then those pieces of the measurement puzzle then have to be connected with a variety of different techniques for locating individuals who might be at risk of being trafficking victims, whether that's through law enforcement, social service agencies, community-based organizations, field teams, lots of different ways that you can do that. But you need to know what it is that you mean by human trafficking, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to have one specific definition, at least as I think about it.
Just to follow up a little bit, Fabrizio, would you mind talking a little bit about how you dealt with those varying definitional issues when trying to assess data internationally across countries in terms of how they define trafficking in various ways to create standard measures?
Yes. Yes. First, before getting to this point, I would like to answer to the questions on what are the main challenges. And at the moment, I think, from my perspective, the major challenge is to study what is the hidden population, what is the real number of victims, and in order to understand also trends over time and to understand more about the phenomenon. We are basically trying to have an idea of the iceberg by analyzing the tip of the iceberg in this moment. So it's a very shaky base. I think understanding, developing methodology to study the hidden phenomenon is extremely relevant at this point. Going back to your questions on the definition, well, of course, as United Nations, we use the Palermo Protocol, the UN Trafficking Persons Protocol supplementing the TOC Convention, which is the international standard. As far as this research activity is concerned, the definition that we use is actually the national definition, because, as I said, we refer to official statistics, and these are data that we have collected by the national authorities. So, as a consequence, we are reporting the definition that each national authority is adopting. And I think in this type of study, the basic rule is transparency. If you go to the country profile of the report, most of the time what we use is the article of the criminal code these criminal justice statistics are referring to. For instance, in some countries, the article of the criminal code might not refer to trafficking persons according to the UN protocol, but might refer to, for instance, buy and selling of persons. And in this case, we refer exactly, well, these statistics are referring to this article of the criminal code, buy and selling of persons. I think this is the only way we can deal when we use, let's say, international or cross-country, let's say, type of studies, in order to avoid, since every country, every government, every legislation adopts its own, let's say, definition. We have the only possible way is really to be transparent and to represent exactly the article of so the national definition adopted by the national authority.
Thanks very much, Fabrizio. We had a follow-up question actually for you from Jonathan Schoonover, who asked, it looked like about 20% of the victims of trafficking were children from your data. Is there any idea what that percent would be if prostitution was removed?
Well, this would be extremely difficult. If I understand correctly, the question is how many child victims are exploited in forced labor. So what is the number of child victims if we remove prostitution? Well, I don't have a number. I don't have a specific answer to this. What I can say is that some parts of the world, for instance, West Africa, or for instance, Southeast Asia, child trafficking is, as I said before, predominant. So child victims are more than 50% of the total victims detected. And in West Africa, most of these victims are in forced labor, for instance. Whereas in Southeast Asia, most of these child victims are in sexual exploitation. So yes, there are some different patterns. I don't have the global figures, but we have many regional patterns, and often global averages are giving a wrong idea, because reality is really changing from area, from region, from country to country. So in terms of child victims in forced labor, probably West Africa appears to be, from our data, the let's say the main, the most relevant area.
Thanks very much, Fabrizio. I'll just give the panelists a chance to chime in to see if anyone else had questions of your own or answers to any of the questions that have been asked so far you didn't get a chance to jump in on before we move on to some other questions. No? Okay. Well, one of the questions that I had as a follow-up question in thinking about listening to the presentations is we have a variety of different things we've discussed so far about definitions and about measurement issues. And I was wondering if people had thoughts about the best way that we could help practitioners understand the use of data. What advice from the panelists' sort of wide scope of knowledge of this area would we give to practitioners and others in the field trying to make sense of the data that exists out there? How would you advise folks to use existing data sources? And what ways can we actually try to improve the way that we actually use data to implement or evaluate public policy? Does someone want to start?
This is Duren. I can start. I think the use of these data is, I've tried to qualify it many times, but folks have said, it's such an emerging field. We're just starting to really learn what we don't know, and it's a hard area to get valid and reliable information on. And so I think that I would just urge a great deal of caution when making any generalizations and really just understanding the source of the data that folks are using. I know that the literature reviews have been done and there's not a lot of information out there, but we are just at the infancy of this, and so hopefully with formats like this where we can get more information out, and with the legislation and renewed interest in some of the funding, that there will be more understanding of the issue. But to date, I really think that the data that are out there are in their infancy and just should be used with great caution, because we really don't have a good handle at all of what the true scope of the problem is.
I agree with Duren, but I would also want to flip this, Elzbieta. I would like to flip the answer and say, well, the service providers and practitioners ought to be encouraged to also collect data, even if it is just on the people that they are serving, and making sure that it is collected at least across the agency in a standardized way. We have done another study on the trafficked kids that have been trafficked into the United States, and as part of that research, I had done a very extensive case file review, and I have to tell you that there is a gold mine in certain agencies of information there. In other agencies, there is virtually nothing that if I were to design an intervention or a treatment modality, I would not know where to begin because the data is so scarce. And going back to Fabrizio's answer, in the study that we had done, somebody asked if we took the sexual exploitation out or the prostitution out, what would be the picture? The children in trafficked to the United States, that's 146 at the time that we were looking at them, for the most part, experience both types of exploitation. And, however, in the case files, many practitioners will zero in on one or the other without really linking the two. So there is some need for a discussion about how to do it with preserving confidentiality and all the good stuff that we're concerned about, and at the same time sharing across agencies as well.
Neil, I was wondering if you had thoughts about how the tool that you actually developed for victim service providers to do some of what Elzbieta was just talking about, to assess victims and be able to maybe use some standardized protocols and data collection instruments. Is there thoughts that this tool will be rolled out elsewhere or is being piloted in other places outside of New York City?
Well, I don't know if it's being piloted in other places. It's just too recent in its dissemination. We're planning on doing some more extensive work in a variety of ways. One, we thoroughly agree that you need a standardized tool. Well, we agree that the tool needs to be integrated into the practices and procedures, of each agency in a standardized way, and to the extent possible, a standardized way across agencies. So what we found and what we eventually recommended was that the protocol be standardized, that is versatile, be able to have a number of questions in it that help distinguish between labor exploitation, different kinds of labor exploitation. Also, questions which would enable you to distinguish between smuggling and trafficking, non-resident labor populations or migrant labor populations who are not involved in either trafficking or smuggling that may look like traffickers. The notion that came across loud and clear from the agencies, one, they wanted a comprehensive instrument. It had to be simple. It had to be an instrument which they could adapt into their varying intake procedures. Some agencies that we piloted in were very, very small, had relatively few clients, and they needed an instrument which they could integrate into their general intake discussions in ways where they might ask a few questions at one point, then come back at some later interviewing time and ask some additional questions, but always have the questions available that they could draw from and the protocols they could go back to and code onto so that they would have available in hard copy, and we also promoted an automated format, the standardized format that was comprehensive in content, discriminating in its capacity to look at different forms of trafficking, and it would allow agencies, one, to understand the prevalence in their with regard to trafficking for their particular clientele. It would enable them to look over time at changes in the prevalence, which is the trend issue that was mentioned earlier, and then slowly build into the protocol, the measurement protocol, questions that relate to causation and dynamics and service options for those clients. So our recommendations are start small, small steps, be versatile in having an instrument that could be used in a variety of different settings, that could be expanded, and that could also it could be expanded to different social service agencies, and which were supported by both training and administrative protocols. We found that a simple standardized instrument that wasn't supported by intense prior training and prior continuing quality control monitoring stood relatively little chance of being useful to any agency, and relatively little chance of being useful across agencies if you wanted to compile data from one agency to another. I hope that's responsive.
Great, Neil. Thanks so much. That was fantastic. Gave us a really good description on how it's being used and potential ways that it could be used in the future, and challenges around even using a tool that folks worked for a long time on agreeing upon. One of the things that I certainly had seen in a study that myself and some colleagues from Northeastern University did for the National Institute of Justice, looking at law enforcement responses to trafficking, and having a chance to talk to a lot of law enforcement agencies who are working either in task forces or working through other mechanisms very closely with victim service providers, was that even when these groups had good working relationships and saw a number of victims, there were oftentimes extreme disagreements about whether or not victims who had come to the attention of law enforcement were in fact victims of trafficking, which I think increasingly makes the challenge of using official sources of data to collect information problematic. When groups that work together on task forces or other agencies where there is a collaborative relationship have very strong disagreements about whether or not a crime like trafficking has actually occurred and this is a victim of trafficking that they're dealing with. It's unique. We don't find the same instances all the time with other joint efforts to deal with problems like guns or drugs or other issues where there may be arguments about whether cases should be taken federally or to state levels, but there's oftentimes not disagreements about whether or not a crime has occurred. And in these cases, we oftentimes find NGOs, victim service providers, and law enforcement all really struggling with very difficult conceptualizations about whether or not the person that they're dealing with that they have actually identified is a victim of trafficking or is an illegal migrant and should be put into deportation proceedings, or is a victim of a different kind of crime that should be classified and treated differently. So there are some real challenges here that are endemic to the nature of the crime that make both measurement and dealing with this problem more problematic even under the best circumstances of collaborative definition consensus building. Sort of pulling off the line of thinking about how we develop data collection strategies, I was going back to thinking about Neil's illustration you had of the concentric circles. And the largest circle is obviously that group of trafficking victims that has not been identified by anyone. And so I was wondering if the panelists had ideas about how we begin to tap into measuring and understanding the experiences of those victims that don't come into contact with law enforcement agencies or social service providers, for whom we might, though we're struggling with ways to collect good data about, have better avenues for collecting systematic data. Either Elzbieta, or in thinking about reviewing studies that had been done, were there some innovative methodologies for getting at the truly hidden populations?
Well, the only sort of methodological approach that people talk about to get at that issue is the capture-recapture, sampling, where you might put out an invitation to participate in the study, and then a person will, get somebody else. I know that Kurt Robinson from Johns Hopkins has just gotten funding to use that methodology in Thailand. So we should stay tuned to see, how that will work for him and whether he will exactly be able to get to some of the hidden types of populations. I know that the FAFO Institute in Norway also used that tool to study a broader category of victims, and that is sex workers who had been victimized, and then looked at trafficking within that.
Well, that's
about it.
This is Neil Weiner. That's certainly one technique that's been recommended. There are other techniques as well. There's peer-driven, qualitative techniques that use fairly standardized and rigorous peer-driven identification, where you may identify a trafficking victim, perhaps through contact with a service agency, and then through a variety of questions and procedures, ask about contact networks of other trafficking victims who may be emancipated, presumably emancipated. So there are qualitative techniques out there that can also be used in addition to the capture-recapture, which requires a number of sophisticated quantitative assumptions about what the reality is out there in terms of the.
Excuse me, Mr. Weiner. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we're just getting a complaint that you weren't coming through very loudly. If you could get closer to your speakerphone.
I'm hoping this is close enough. Okay.
That sounds much better. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. What I was saying is that there are also qualitative techniques and versions of sophisticated, actually quantitative techniques, which are peer-driven networks, where you might start with a number of agency identified trafficking victims, and then ask for networks, questions about others in their immediate network who were also, or at least considered by that person to be an emancipated trafficking victim. So there are those techniques out there that are being used by qualitative researchers to great advantage in gang research and public health and a variety of other venues. I think everyone ought to bear in mind that each of these techniques, and Amy laid it out very clearly at the beginning, each of these techniques, each data source, and either whether it's administrative and official data or interview data or third-party data, has its advantages and disadvantages, and that each of the techniques for collecting data, even within those categories, administrative data or face-to-face data, has its advantages and disadvantages, and you need a number of different techniques applied in the same venue, same setting, I think, in order to make a robust sense of what the prevalence issues are, how many victims there are, and also to take the next step and ask questions about what are the causes and consequences and policy implications for service delivery and law enforcement protection based on the information that we get. So a number of different approaches that need to be coordinated in order to minimize the distortions that are embedded in each of those approaches.
If I may, is Fabrizio speaking. Together with the hidden population, I would also like to add, for instance, the studies of Thomas Steinfath, also adopting a capture-recapture technique in Cambodia, I think. it's also very interesting on the estimation of the number of victims. Another interesting area for data collection research, understanding the phenomenon is, which I think is totally missing on trafficking in persons, is to have more quantitative information on the market. I know it's very sounds very bad to call it like this, but if we compare trafficking in persons with, for instance, drugs trafficking or small arms trafficking, at least in drugs, in the drugs market, we know, for instance, the prices of illegal drugs. We know more or less the overall production or the estimated overall production of drugs, and we may arrive also to understand the demand of illegal drugs. This is an area which in trafficking in person is totally unknown, and eventually I don't think it's so complicated to understand, for instance, what would be the market prices in the, for instance, in the sex market, where victims of trafficking might be exploited, or another element which I think is very important is the level of vulnerability of specific target population, which is something that could be measured on a regular basis through very simple population surveys, understanding what are the motivation of a target, a vulnerable population to, for instance, migrate without using let's say particular precaution measures to defend themselves from traffickers. I think that these variables, these elements, could be easily measured in order to have a better understanding, let's say, on the dynamics of the market.
Those are all really excellent suggestions. I think we're going to take our last question as we're coming to the end of our time, and I would pose this. I'll pose this first to Duren, and anyone else can certainly jump in. But we had a question about who is really looking at this data. Are policymakers really looking at this data to make policy? Is it resulting in evidence-based policy? So a question about how is this data actually being used, and how do people on the call on this panel foresee that it would be used in the best ways to enhance evidence-based policies?
I'd like to say, first of all, that there's a congressional mandate to get a sense of the scope of the problem. And so we've recently submitted a report to Congress that talks about what we have learned through the human trafficking reporting system, but also what the Department of Justice has learned as far as the scope of the problem, otherwise the magnitude of the market, as we were just talking about, what is the size and the scope of the commercial sex economy in the United States. And so Congress is taking a look at this, and as far as policymakers, we've received some calls here at BJS for more information related to the statistics that we've reported, but I can't comment further on how they would be taking that information and using it.
Were there others that had comments on the use of the data for evidence-based policy?
Yeah, Fabrizio again. I would not comment on who will use the data. Of course, governments and international organizations or other subjects, or academia, for instance. What is important from my experience is the fact that data collection has to be carried out constantly over time. Something that is true today will not be true tomorrow. It's a reality that is changing, and we have to be aware of this. The result of our research, the patterns and the flows emerging from our research today may different very rapidly in few years. So the important is to conduct data collection on a constant manner, systematically, in order not to or not to address this phenomenon in some manner that is not adequate anymore. So to let's say focus the policy implication, to tune the policy implication with the results of research in a constant-based approach.
All right, I think that will pretty much conclude our discussion today. Thank you to all of the panelists for joining the conversation. I want to give a special thanks to Christina Bain from Harvard University for actually pulling together this wonderful dialogue and discussion about a very difficult issue, and to Jim Cooney for actually helping us with the technical assistance with the call. It's actually been a pleasure for me to speak to all of you about trafficking in our dialogue today. I think that there's a few takeaway messages from the conversation, one of which is that while there are a lot of challenges that all of our panelists have excellently discussed about the collection and analysis of data on a difficult issue like human trafficking, there are some very promising practices and use of techniques from other disciplines that can be employed to help us get better data and improve our ability to use that data to truly enhance evidence-based practices. I'd like to remind all the callers that we'll have resources available on the website in which you logged into this call if you'd like to find out further information, and feel free to send emails if you have additional questions, and we'd be happy to get back to you. So thanks again for joining the call today, and for all the panelists for your information and wisdom you provided about a difficult but very important subject as we move forward in the field of human trafficking research.